Good afternoon. I'm Walt Bauer, and I'd like to welcome you to the Human Development Institute's second fall seminar. We welcome the participants who are joining us online, as well as the participants who are here with us at the University of Kentucky. Our presenters will provide an opportunity for questions this afternoon, and we welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions in the chat box if you are online. Should you have any questions about CEUs, you can contact me. Please take a moment at the conclusion of the seminar to complete our brief evaluation. The evaluation will be sent to your email address after the seminar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming seminars. Now for introductions, and the title of the seminar is Emerging Disabilities. For introductions, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Shepherd-Jones, Executive Director, UK's Human Development Institute.
Thank you, Walt.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for being here with us this afternoon at our second seminar on emerging disabilities. And I am very honored and humbled to be joined this afternoon by Mr. Andy Imparato and Dr. Philip Rumrill. And as we were preparing for the seminar, I think one of the things that struck out to me most was all of the questions that I kept getting asked about what does that mean, emerging disabilities? Is that about disabilities that have more prevalence, that we're seeing more of now? Is it about disabilities just because we're talking about them more as society? I think the shifts that we've seen in technological advances recently have made us really have a lot more questions about disability, how we define them, how we interpret who we are. Because not only are people now outliving disabilities, which they may not have, and surviving injuries and illnesses that they previously wouldn't, but we're also talking about disabilities that may or may not be present when we talk about designer babies. So this conversation this afternoon could become pretty wide-ranging. My job is to try to keep us from going off the rails. We'll see how well I do with that. I'll introduce our panelists, and then I think if we can, we'll go around the room because everyone would also like to know who's here with us today as well. And first I'll introduce Dr. Philip Rumrill. He is a professor and founding center director from Kent State University, Rehabilitation Counseling. And I'm also very happy to say that he is the newly hired Director of Research and Training here at the Human Development Institute. So I guess this is your first real official gig. And,
glad to be here. Thank you.
And Dr. Rumrill is, I can honestly say that he has literally written the book on emerging disabilities. There is a textbook called Emerging Disabilities that he wrote.
Sorry about that.
2016.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying. And Andy Imparato, as many of you know in the audience, is the executive director at the Association of University Centers on Disability. He's been there since 2013, 6 years. And he leads our national network. And prior to this role, he has had a fascinating history as a disability rights lawyer and advocate. Worked with Senator Tom Harkin. Prior to that, was the president and CEO of the AAPD, American Association of People with Disabilities. And he's been a great friend to the Human Development Institute over the years, Kentucky's University Center on Disability. And we are so glad that he has joined us this afternoon to have this chat with a few close friends, both here live and out in the world. And now maybe we could just quickly go around. And if you wouldn't mind saying your name and what brings you here this afternoon, that would be really helpful. Your name and perhaps if you're associated with an organization, who you're with. You want to get us started?
Oh, My name is Haley Hammond. I'm with the Division of Intellectual Disabilities, and I just came to learn about emerging disabilities.
Awesome.
My name is Laura Gratcher Page. I am an RA here at HDI working on the Quality Life Project.
My name's Kelly McClellan. I am HDI field staff and looking for an opportunity to get some more training and get out of either off the road or out of my field office. So
Great.
nice opportunity to meet with people.
I'm Dana Manning. I do data work for several projects here at HDI, especially projects that look at special education indicators that are federally required. And I'm interested particularly in emerging disabilities in the K through 12 area. So it's my interest.
Thanks.
I'm Beth Potter. I work here at HDI on the Retain Project and in Information Services. Glad to have you all here. I'm Shirley Cron. I'm the Emerging Director for CHI, St. Joseph Medical Group, but I'm also currently working on the Retain Project as the employer liaison, so I'm here to continue to learn.
Tony LoBianco, I'm here at HDI. I direct the Kentucky Coastal Outcome Center, and I'm here because I guess I haven't read the book yet, Phil.
Sorry about that. You may need to now.
I'm Gary Whaley. I'm the director of the Southeast ADA Center, part of the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. So obviously this is a topic I'm very interested in.
Katie Wolf Whaley, I work here at HDI on employment initiatives.
And I'm Carolyn Wheeler, and I started at HDI actually 29 years ago this month. I just realized.
Oh, wow.
That's why I'm really saying that to clarify. I've been very, very, very fortunate to be here this long. And actually, my very first job was at what is now My Soccer Center. When my mother created a job for me when she worked there. So anyway, it's been a part of the university affiliated network for many, many years. I'm very, very fortunate to be a part of it.
And was an RA for Wolfensburg.
Well, that's true too. But you all are famous people, so that's why I'm here.
Maurice Dawson, I'm part of the HDI Texas.
Addie Singleton, also at HDI.
I'm Maria Complin. I'm here at HDI working primarily on a transportation initiative, and I just started the graduate certificate program.
My name is Alicia Sullivan. I am a first-year graduate student at UK. I'm studying my master's in social work, and I'm here to learn more about HDI.
My name is Emily Mosley, and I am also a graduate student in social work, and I'm an RA at HDI.
Walt Bauer at HDI, Pre-Service Training Coordinator.
Christina Espinosa Bard, I'm the Community Education Director at HDI.
Sarah White, I'm publicly at HDI, Washington, Columbia, and both Loma.
Thank you, Kate, with the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. Timely topic.
I'm Libby Stanley. I'm a graduate research assistant working with HDI on the National Coordinating.
I am Amy Rumrell, Bill Rumrell's wife, and I'm a consultant for the Retain Project.
I'm Amy Booth with Child Care Aware of Kentucky.
I'm Don Waller with HDI.
Linda Drawn with Person First Community Services. I work with the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation to do life skills coaching and assessment.
Harold Kleinert, HDI, and I hired Harold.
That is correct. Are you agreeing with me?
Harold was also on the board when they hired me, so you hired me too.
I'm Laura Butler. I work on a variety of projects here at HDI, and my degree is in rehab counseling. So I also have books written.
Sorry about that.
Well, maybe as a good way to sort of jump in, if you all wanted to each in turn talk a little bit about your backgrounds and the perspective that you bring when we're thinking about emerging disabilities, would that be a good way to get us
Sounds
going?
good.
Okay. Phil, you want to start or?
Sure, yes,
Okay.
thank you. Well,
And Phil, I just wanted to think of this like Monday Night Football in the old days. You're Frank Gifford.
yes,
So you're the expert. You're going to do the play-by-play.
all right,
I'm Howard Cosell. I'm going to
Okay.
do color
Color
commentary.
I like that.
Nice.
Yeah, we'll do it that way. Yes, that's right. That was a long time ago, wasn't it? Right.
that was long enough where my mom would be telling me I have to go to bed at halftime. So, great. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us here. Andy, it's a great honor and pleasure to be sharing this program with you. And I'm very excited about everything we're going to be doing together, starting sooner rather than later, and looking forward to joining the team and indeed the family here. So Amy and I are very excited to be coming to join you, so much so that I wanted to see if this jacket still fits me. It doesn't, but I'm working on that too, because Andy was telling me about a great low carb diet. Amy, I might consider after dinner tonight. So, but right now, temporarily, I teach in the rehabilitation counseling program at Kent State University. We train counselors to work in the state vocational rehabilitation program, also to work in what we call the private sector, working with injured workers and disabled veterans, for example, mental health settings, substance abuse. At the master's level, we have a PhD program in clinical mental health counseling, so we train counselors and other doctoral level folks to do research and provide direct services to people with disabilities. We also have a Center for Disability Studies where we run funded projects that address the concerns of people with disabilities really across the lifespan and cross disability, a concept that Andy really brought home to us, many years ago in his work with AAPD. The disability community for many years was so fragmentary, and services were really, and advocacy efforts were, focused disability group by disability group. And so I think there's been a move, and Andy's been right in the middle of that, to bring the disability community together in the true sense of that latter term, community. And we've tried to follow those same ideals. In the process of doing that, it occurred to me a few years ago that in listening to the experiences of our practicum and internship students, in looking to see what jobs our graduates were doing, in looking at data, Becky, from the state, from the RSA 911 database, which allows us to look at patterns of enrollment and success in the state VR program nationwide, and in looking just at general population demographic trends in our country, it occurred to me that the disability community, although we're growing in terms of community, it's changing in terms of what that community consists of, who's a member of it, and what kinds of issues people with disabilities are dealing with. So the very nature of disability has changed pretty significantly over the last 30 or 40 years, and indeed people with disabilities as a group have changed as well. And so we started thinking about this concept of emerging disabilities first in a kind of narrow clinical definition, where we're looking at conditions that are either new to medical science or are in the process of being understood more thoroughly or re-understood by medical and social science. So disabilities that appear to be new on the scene, or we've developed some new information or awareness. And with science exploding as much as it has, that's any disabling condition could fit under that category for sure. Then we looked at it just kind of more empirically, and we looked at conditions that are increasing in incidence or prevalence within at least one segment of the population. And so that's how we kind of framed this idea of emerging disability in putting the book together. We learned in our training in rehabilitation counseling, for example, our students didn't have a single lecture when they graduated on autism. And that wasn't right, because they're working in some settings where 30% of their clients and consumers would be dealing with autism. We had no content, for example, in chronic pain, primary pain disorders like fibromyalgia, things like that. You can't do that. You have to understand we have 100 million Americans dealing with some amount of chronic pain. So our curriculum was really not keeping pace with the changes in the disability community and in the clientele and customer base of our graduates. So we felt we needed to sort of take a new look at this entire concept, and then sort of talk about these new and emerging conditions, people who are experiencing them, applying a lifespan perspective to that approach, and hopefully from then we could start framing intervention, service delivery, advocacy efforts, research efforts to further make sure that the services we're providing in partnership with people with disabilities, on behalf of people with disabilities, are actually addressing their needs. Wouldn't that be interesting if we could get to that point? So that was sort of the pretext for the book that we did, and where I'm coming at it from. It's kind of a bureaucratic, in some ways, definition of emerging disability, but it was our way to kind of get the dialogue started. So glad to be here with that. I know Andy's going to have a different take on it, definitionally at least. And back to you, Howard. Yes.
Thank you. A question for Frank, if I'm allowed.
Yes.
What brought you into the field? What made you want to kind of devote your life to this?
Well, when I was 16, I acquired an eye condition called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. I had normal vision up to that point. And the condition claims most of your central vision. So I see you better now, Andy, than I do now. And so based on that experience going into my last year of high school, I grew up in a small town in Vermont, and my parents were working people, not sophisticated about accessing services or advocacy or anything like that. So in order to go on to college, which I wanted to do, I had to become conversant with assistive technology. Had one of the first, the laptops, that with a voice output program. And in those first couple of years of school, I realized how, reliant I was on the kind of support and advocacy of other people, and attributed that to a lot of the, modest success I did have in school, and started thinking I was a psychology major, so I wanted to be a waiter. No, I know you have to go to grad school, right, if you do that. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I sort of liked thinking about human behavior, how the mind works, that kind of stuff. And this was new to me and interesting enough to me. And then I didn't realize at the time, this was in 1985 when this happened, but there's really a disability movement, and I started learning more and more about that, studying it formally, took a degree in counseling, my doctorate in rehabilitation at the University of Arkansas. And so that really kind of led me into this. I wasn't, I do this all the time with our students. How many of you grew up wanting to be a rehab counselor? Nobody does. You don't know what that is. And so you have to sort of come to it, and we all have our story, but there's usually a personal connection to that. And I'm glad you asked me that, Andy, because that does kind of continues to drive the things that, that we do. And in some, small way, being able to be part of a field that gives back, to in my own way, for all of the support and assistance that I had in my own process is really gratifying. And we try to make sure that the projects we do, and you certainly do that here, have a real impact on people's lives. So I know firsthand the impact of that, and I don't take that for granted, not for a second. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say in terms of the perspective that I bring, so like Phil, I have lived experience with a disability. I have bipolar disorder, which I had my first serious episode of depression during my last semester of law school, which was about 30 years ago. So I'm coming up on my 30-year anniversary. And I took a couple years to have it settle into a pattern and get a diagnosis. But basically, I have less energy, less self-confidence, and I'm easier to be around when there's not a lot of sunlight. I have more energy, more self-confidence, and sometimes more obnoxious when there is a lot of sunlight, and I don't sleep as well when there's a lot of sunlight. I kind of found the disability movement as a baby lawyer in Boston, was mentored by folks at the Protection and Advocacy Agency where I was doing a fellowship, and got to know the independent living movement in Boston and the there was a psychiatric survivor movement at the time. That's what they called themselves. Judy Chamberlain was one of the pioneers in that movement. She wrote a book in the 1970s called On Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. So she was a mentor for me early on. And the thing that I got in my kind of early years in Boston was the idea that disability is a natural part of the human experience, and our lived experience with a disability should not prevent us from doing anything we want to do. And I found that very empowering. I grew up crunchy granola, California. Anything that was natural was good from my perspective. So I like the idea that disability is natural. And I certainly didn't get that message from the mental health professionals that I was seeing as I was trying to kind of just manage my symptoms. You know, I guess I've been in Washington now for 26 years. So one of the hats I wear is a Washington hat, for better or for worse. You know, when I think about emerging disabilities, I'm not thinking about the science. I'm thinking about who's getting the resources, who's getting the political attention, who has a caucus that's powerful, that's trying to advance their agenda. I'm thinking about, you know, I feel like our movement, going back to the beginning of the disability movement, it's hard to know where to start. The deaf community was doing a lot of cool things before a lot of the rest of the disability community, and so was the blindness community. But I feel like our movement has had fits and starts about what is a disability, who's allowed to claim that. The deaf community to this day generally doesn't like the term. There are other parts of the disability community that don't like the word disability. I would say the average American who's protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act will never self-identify as a person with a disability because they don't embrace that term. So I feel like when we talk about emerging disabilities, one of the interesting questions is who is comfortable claiming that term and how is that changing over time? And I don't know if we're studying that, but I think it's an interesting thing to study. We do have a researcher at Vanderbilt. We have a University Center for Excellence in Vanderbilt, but she was also at our center in Kansas before going to Vanderbilt, named Anjali Forber-Pratt. I'm guessing, Phil, you're familiar with her. But Anjali was a Paralympic sprinter, PhD, and is doing research. A lot of her work is really for the rehabilitation counseling field. But her basic point is where an individual is in their own development of their identity as a person with a disability will affect the success that they have in the labor market. And her theory is if you're a rehabilitation counselor, one of the things you need to do is assess where your client is in terms of their comfort with their own identity as a person with a disability and help address that if it's going to be a barrier in terms of them having success in the labor force. So Phil, you're much more familiar with the literature than I am, but I get the sense that the stuff that Anjali is doing is kind of unique in some ways.
Yes, it is unique. And I also think in terms of clinical practice, when you're working with people with disabilities, really in any kind of context, where the disability experience fits into their own self-concept developmentally, and as you mentioned, kind of where you're at in life when it occurs to you. If you're born with it, that's really different. If you're 65 years old and you acquire, you know, a chronic illness or something, you haven't seen yourself that way. So how do you use the term and do you embrace it in that way? But what, you know, to what extent does disability frame, you know, who you are in your own mind first, and then how you project that out? And UK's own Malachi Bishop, who's now at the University of Wisconsin, 15 years ago or so, really kind of coined the term centrality as you think about it. And this was more an internal process of disability. But that very thing, he theorized that it was very instructive to determine how central or salient the disability experience is in people's lives. And sometimes a central view of disability and your self-concept can be very empowering. It's part of who you are, and you choose to embrace it or seek better ways of having it addressed and your experience addressed in the community. That's one. The other way is it can sometimes work exactly the opposite way. It can be very central to your experience, but your experience of it, reflections from other people are negative. You don't find people to be supportive. You find that you're stigmatized, you're labeled, you're limited, you're depersonalized. And therefore, it creates a negative effect on self-concept. So figuring out where people are with that, I think, is really key, more important probably than a label, whether it's an emerging disability or not, whether it's chronic or not, whether it's congenital or not, but where that fits in at the individual level and understanding that that is shaped by our experiences with our outside world. So you encourage and support people to find the resources in their communities for the kind of success and empowerment that we all want to have, then that person might have a very central view of disability in their own, schema about their lives. And it might really fuel them in various ways. It can also really discourage folks depending on how we reflect it back. So I think that's a really important distinction, and Anjali's work there gets right at that.
And the only other thing I'll say, on the kind of perspective that I bring, I guess you could call me a disability evangelist in the sense that I strongly encourage everybody that I encounter who has anything remotely connected to a disability that would be protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a very broad definition of disability, to incorporate their identity into their professional identity. I meet people all over the AUCD network who have ADHD, dyslexia, anxiety, you name it. And people generally share with me whatever their issues are, but they rarely are encouraged by anybody else to talk about it in a university setting, to talk about it in a professional setting, because it could be used against them. And I feel like if we're going to work in this field and we're going to try to change the world with and for people with disabilities, we need to be evangelists about the idea that we need to bring our disabilities with us into our professional identities and our professional spaces. Just like I would argue it's good to bring your sexual orientation, be proud of your gender, be proud of whatever it is, your region of the country, the basketball team you root for, whatever. And if we're not proud of that part of who we are, I feel like the movement, the progress we're making will be slower, especially for people that have achieved a lot and feel like they still need to be in the closet with their disability. Bipolar disorder is very high incidence. So I meet people with bipolar disorder all the time in incredibly high-powered jobs. And I meet people with bipolar disorder who work in the disability field who are not comfortable being out with their bipolar disorder. So when they wrote the ADA, they tended to privilege privacy. The ADA says if you tell your employer that you have a disability because you need an accommodation, the employer has to keep that confidential. And there's a lot of protections around privacy and who's allowed to know and when are they allowed to ask and how are they allowed to ask. And I totally get why that was necessary 30 years ago, and I totally get why that may be important in some circumstances. But I think there's nothing in the ADA that prevents an employer from creating an environment where everybody is open about their disabilities to everyone in the workplace. And I feel like that is going to create transformational change much faster than if we're still very concerned about privacy and trying to keep this in this very kind of contained communication between the employee and their supervisor around a reasonable accommodation. Disability is much bigger than a need for a reasonable accommodation. It's a life experience that can be used to inform any company, any employer in a good way if people feel comfortable sharing what they've experienced, what they've learned from it, and the insights that flow from it. So I just want to say I'm an unapologetic pro-disability person. I like it when people are out with their disabilities. I don't think it's good to force people to be out or to out people, but I do think it's good to encourage them to be open. When I interviewed for the job at AAPD, one of the things I said to the search committee is that I wanted to make disability sexy. Like the concept of disability can be sexy. We can own that word and make people like feel jealous if they're not disabled, you know. but we have to actually, you know, talk about it like it's sexy. And I just feel like that's been hard for a lot of folks, I think in academia especially.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because that, for me, when you talk about higher education, I think there are a lot of low ceilings there, and in an environment where you would anticipate the most openness and the most diversity of thoughts and expression, that can be really one of the more challenging places. I think that when we do a lot of work. And so sometimes you just kind of think, you know, we expect better. For myself, I guess for me, disability came into play for me when I was at the University of Vermont in the January, and it snows up there a bit, if you're familiar with Vermont. And I got stuck in a snowbank on my way to class. And that never had happened to me before. And I'm like, something bad wrong is going on here.
And this was before cell phones?
They were really big then, you know, so somebody had to come and literally, you know, pull on my chair to help me get out of the snowbank. And at that point, for me, it was really like the big aha moment of, and it sounds silly, but I was like, oh my God, I'm in a wheelchair. Like it hadn't really occurred to me before that. And I was an undergraduate in animal science, and, you know, really very practical, pragmatic. We would castrate piglets and dehorn. If you ever need this done, let me know. I still have the tools.
Stay far away.
I can clear a party out pretty quick too. But I remember not knowing what to do at that moment. And I thought I went to my advisor's office, and he was this big old burly Vermont farmer, and he's wearing his coveralls, and I remember being a little bit weepy, and I said I was stuck, and there's snow that's melting off the bottom of my chair, so there's this expanding puddle that's growing out from under my chair while we're talking, and he said, well, I guess you're either going to pack it up or figure it out. And I'm like, oh, that's such good Yankee wisdom. And that was, I think, for me, a point where I recognized that it was time to integrate all the parts of my life. And coming to Kentucky from there was a huge opportunity, because coming here, the advances in technology and driver rehabilitation is what got me interested in the fields, because the high-tech equipment wasn't available where I was from. But Kentucky has one of the premier driver rehabilitation programs. And I went there and I was able to get my license, and I was able to go to the drive-through at a restaurant for the first time, which is a big deal if you've never been able to do that before.
And do you think that's because Kentucky has a lot of veterans, and they had disabled veterans that came back and wanted to drive? Or what do you think made that happen in Kentucky?
You know, Kentucky was just one of those places that I guess if you're in the VR field, you sort of know where the specialty areas are. And Kentucky has had a long history of the high-end driver modifications with a fleet of vehicles and a cadre of certified driver rehab specialists. So I don't know, and Becky may be able to speak to this more.
We were thinking possibly the farming.
With agribility.
But also there's a lot of really rural areas that without transportation, you are isolated.
Yeah, that's a good
And so
point.
there was probably that feedback from our consumers that said, we also do bioptic driving, and not every state does that. So I think that's a part of it, is
combination
to try to have some access.
What is bioptic driving?
That would be for an individual with vision problems.
Okay.
That medically be approved to use a bioptic equipment.
So is Phil going to be able to drive in Kentucky?
Ooh, I like that. We're gonna go to one of those bourbon tours, and then I'm gonna see if I can convince Amy after a few drinks I'd like to try.
Watch out.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll put you on
It's
GPS.
interesting. I was at the Department of Transportation 2 days ago, I think 2 days ago, and the Secretary of Transportation was hosting a convening on autonomous vehicles. So I learned a lot about that. I have no idea when it's going to happen, but it sounds like it'll happen first with mass transit and like long haul trucking and stuff like that. So it's an interesting thing.
It is. And that will be a game changer.
Yeah.
For people.
Amy knows I want to be the second person to get one of those cars that drive themselves. You know, I want someone else to try it out first, but as soon as I get my hands on one of those, I won't need a ride to the store. It's going to be really fun.
So I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but you know, what factors do you think are the strongest ones for how we define disability? Is it, you know, is it internal? Is it that central element, or is it more policy? And is it ADA? What drives our disability definitions? And I ask that because, you know, we've got a project here where we are providing supports to individuals who are on the job and may have injuries or illnesses that put them at risk of leaving the workforce and then, you know, moving into the disability roles. And what we're finding is that sometimes people can't really identify with it. They think, oh, that's somebody with a disability. That's not me, right? So it's that how do we come to that common kind of definition, or can we?
Do you want to go first, Phil, since you wrote the book?
Oh, yeah, no pressure, right? You know, I think in terms of, it's an interesting question, what do we do in terms of defining it? But I've become more interested over the last, 25 years of teaching classes and preparing counselors. We can give them a PowerPoint on defining, what does your blood sugar level have to be after 6 hours of fasting in order to have, diabetes or whatever. But what we do about it and what it means in the person's life, to me, is more important than, what the label is or even how we define it. So in terms of response, I don't mean to evade the question totally, but I'm thinking that and what it is that, in the sort of, if disability by its very nature means you're not able to do something that other people can do, what is the impact of that? And what are other factors that either limit or facilitate your participation in the environment of your own choice? And I think in that, I think it's pretty clear that, to me anyway, through my own experiences and working in the field and as a researcher and an advocate too, I think that the attitudes of people who don't have disabilities and responses to other people are much more limiting than the functional limitations associated with someone's actual condition. That's really where the action is in terms of determining outcome, is in external attitudes, also in environmental supports or lack of environmental supports. That determines mobility and ability more than what's going on, with the individual. I teach a class at Kent State called Psychosocial Impact of Disability. And in that class, we talk about myths and misconceptions about people with disabilities that are held by society at large. And there's just a few of them. If you'll indulge me for just a minute, I'll tell you what, some of them are. And I just had a really interesting personal experience with this very thing I'm talking about a few years ago that I think is instructive. So we talk about these things that society at large thinks about people with disabilities that may or may not be the case. May be the case for certain individuals, but not for everybody. And when you apply these misconceptions, you're losing the opportunity to really get to know what somebody's really all about, okay? So one of these we call, the idea is called spread, and that is that you infer limitations upon the person that aren't apparent by virtue of his or her disability. So you think that because someone has a mobility impairment that they might be not as intelligent, or you might have to speak to them in a different way, or you might have to point things out to them in the environment, whatever that might be. You might think that because someone has an intellectual disability that he or she might not be able to walk fast. Okay, so the idea is we think people's limitations go to other areas. That's one. So the myth or misconception of spread. There's another myth that we talk about in terms of unemployability, right? We have a big problem with labor force participation of people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities of working age in America are not employed. And the misconception is that people with disabilities aren't able to work and can't support themselves. So the myth of reliance, dependency, and unemployability is another one. Another myth of asexuality, right? That people with disabilities don't have the same romantic and sexual interests as people who don't have disabilities, and that disability is not, you talked about disability being sexy. Part of the why we want to get there is there's a sense from people is that it affects people's appearance and therefore affects their attractiveness and sometimes their interests, so that people's desires at this most basic level of expression are different, aberrant, and so we run into this. And you see this in developmental disabilities programs, in group homes, in terms of how they support people doing those kinds of things like that. And then the myth of congregation. Many people with disabilities want to come together around commonalities, but it is a misconception to assume that people with disabilities only want to be around other people with disabilities, right? So the whole kind of full inclusion idea is sometimes counterintuitive. And these are just a few of them that sort of that we talk about in class, and we kind of break them down, and how we really got to look at where the person himself or herself